I really want to applaud the presenters that went before me, setting the stage and getting us into that very complicated time of not only leading up to the war, but during the war, and we're going to start to come out of it now and see what happens. When the armistice went into effect on November 11th, 1918, cheering crowds swarmed the streets of cities across the United States. In Europe, American troops toasted each other on their good fortune to survive. The Great War was over. We had won. The boys were coming home. The celebrations were fast and furious. Unfortunately, they didn't last. While we in Marion, in Dubuque, and Atlanta celebrated a decisive victory in the war to end all wars, we weren't aware of some things that were going to seriously impact the post-war days ahead. We were not aware that President Woodrow Wilson's intense focus on bringing peace to Europe and his vision of creating a League of Nations had diminished his interest in laying out a plan for transitioning the home front from wartime to peacetime, and that this lack of planning was going to have dire consequences for the nation heading into the 1920s. There is no doubt that Wilson operated best as a wartime president because it matched his vision of how a president should govern. He assembled a cabinet, purposely, of men who were not leaders in their own rights. He didn't want them spearheading programs and making decisions. He wanted them to be dependent upon him. He thrived with the expansion of government agencies during wartime, making it possible for him sometimes to sidetrack Congress, and some in Congress accused him of being dictatorial. In 1919, just a few months after the armistice, many of the wartime agencies naturally dissolved, but Wilson, who had centered so much power in himself, unwittingly created a problem. Now, I want you to hear what historian Robert K. Murray said. Murray was author of the Harding era. We consider that a wonderful resource about the Harding presidency. Murray says, if Wilson was master of this system during the war, he became its major post-war victim. He ignored the necessity for adequate post-war planning and a control of bureaucratic demobilization and reorganization. When the most crucial of the wartime agencies were dissolved, Wilson provided no substitutes for the interim exercise of power or decision-making, and the ensuing vacuum was never filled. His subsequent illness provided a convenient excuse for glossing over this failure in foresight. But even before his stroke, Wilson had shown signs of being unable to adjust to changing post-war circumstances, as well as to adapt his liberal philosophy to post-war needs. As Murray mentioned, Wilson's strokes in September and October 1919 complicated a chaotic situation that was quickly grinding the nation to a halt after the armistice. We, the American people, did not know the extent of Wilson's poor health, and that he was virtually unable to be in charge. Now, in my mind, I liken this time in American history, right after the post-war, or right at the post-war, to a torn cloth. Instead of creating a clean edge when we tear the cloth, we're left with frayed and uneven edges. The immediate post-war period is one half of our cloth. The next phase of America's story is the other half. The frayed edges represent the myriad of problems in 1919 to 21, and someone was going to have to carefully and painstakingly try to pull each thread and somehow stitch it, paste it, tape it to the other piece of cloth. Because there had to be some way to climb from the war experience to whatever the next chapter of America's history was going to be, if the nation were to move forward at all. Most likely, we weren't going to be able to reattach all the frayed edges. Some were going to be disconnected forever, and new ones would have to be created. Now, Republican Warren G. Harding, newly elected President of the United States, rode with a sickly Woodrow Wilson from the White House to the Capitol on March 4th, 1921. It was Inauguration Day. Wilson didn't like Harding, considered him a lightweight. Harding admired Wilson's intellect, but had always found him to be a stiff and cold personality. These were vastly different men with vastly different views of governing who were exchanging the presidency. Let's look at the complicated picture of America President Harding faced in 1921. When we blew the last horn and shook the last of the confetti from our hair in November 1918, we were jolted into a new reality. During the war, many of the nation's industries had converted their regular production to making war goods. Pollock Steel in Cincinnati, for example, made parts for battleships. The Lionel Company in Michigan made compasses instead of model trains. The Huber Company here in Marion, longtime producer of farm machinery, expanded its production lines to include 2 new farm tractor designs, as well as bean and pea threshers, as the nation's farmers had been asked to increase their farm yields. Women, too, were recruited to work in factories all over the nation. In Ohio, women made tires, trucks, gas masks, and surveillance balloons. Women across the country joined the Women's Land Army to fill the vacancies on the nation's farms. More than 40 million were employed, and wages were good. Better for men than for women, of course. When the armistice went into effect on November 11, 1918, many companies across the country immediately stopped making war goods and eliminated war production. They had just lost, in a matter of days, $2.5 billion in war contracts. And that's $40.5 billion in today's money. You, as a worker at one of these companies, easily could have been handed a pink slip. If you did keep your job, you received notification that your high wartime wages were being cut to pre-war levels. If you're angry, that's understandable. Perhaps you joined your fellow workers and went on strike, just like hundreds of thousands of your fellow workers in the steel, coal, and meatpacking industries. By February 1919, 3 million people were jobless, and the number was rising. If you're a farmer, you've done your patriotic duty during the war and have produced more wheat and corn to feed the soldiers in Europe. You even purchased more land and invested in a new tractor and threshing machine. Your family was set up just fine. But wait, the government said in late 1918 that it doesn't need any additional wheat or corn since the war is over. But my silos are full, you say, and I expanded my farming operation because Uncle Sam urged me to. I owe the bank for that additional land and that Huber tractor I bought. You try to get rid of your excess crops, but the prices have hit rock bottom. Every other farmer is doing the exact same thing. The bank is calling for their payments and you're overextended. By November 1919, the cost of living was 82.2% above the 1914 level. By July 1920, the cost of living was 104.5%, with Americans seeing the biggest jumps in clothing and food. So let's complicate things a little further. Let's bring the soldiers home. By April 1919, 2 million soldiers were released from duty, and in November, another 2 million. Only a relative handful remained in Europe in occupation duty. This rapid demobilization added to the unemployment situation at home. Huge quantities of supplies and armaments were quickly liquidated from Europe, leading to inefficiency, corruption, and a flourishing black market. We had nothing in place besides regular hospitals to tend to the physical and mental problems of returning veterans. Since October 1917, just 6 months after Congress declared war, Wilson and Congress, and that included Harding as well, he was a sitting senator, had been urged to create a game plan for post-war transition. Wilson said it was a good idea, but no action was taken. Congress caught up with, I know this is a surprise, but partisan fighting, also did nothing. Just a month before the armistice, the Council of National Defense decided it should tackle the situation, but the war ended before the group compiled its first report. State and local authorities, farm organizations, and unions saw the writing on the national wall and tried to take matters into their own hands to address financial relief and help returning soldiers find jobs. Everyone was working at cross purposes, from community to community and state to state. Confusion and frustration quickly extinguished the buoyancy of patriotism. The inflation-riddled economy collapsed worldwide in the late spring of 1920 as we headed into the Republican Convention. And of course, that's the one where Harding comes out as the nominee. The election is just 5 months away. Labor earnings fell in 1920 and throughout 21, coupled with more business inactivity to create a stagnant economy. In January 1920, unemployment reached 20%. To put this in perspective, in 1933, in the midst of the Great Depression, the unemployment rate was 25%. Just 2 months ago, this spring, the unemployment rate was 4.3%. So we're not in good shape here. Ask many history buffs, Harding buffs, our Harding home visitors and historians what Warren G. Harding meant by his campaign slogan, a return to normalcy, and this is what they'll say. They'll tell you that he wanted American life to go back to how it was in 1916, before our entry into the war. Just ignore the problems and everything will be okay. It was a feel-good slogan that really didn't mean anything. He wasn't that naive. He knew that you couldn't go back through time and just erase the world-changing events of the past 3 or 6 years. There is nothing in the Harding presidential papers, and I've worked in them extensively, to back up any notion that he thought we would time travel back to a seemingly blissful 1914 or 1916. He knew we were at a different place now, and we must move forward. Normalcy meant he wanted to right the national ship, gently but efficiently. He wanted readjustment, restoration. Well, I'm going to have him tell you what he wanted, actually.
America's present need is not heroic, but healing. Not martyrdom, but normalcy. Not revolution, but restoration. Not agitation, but adjustment. Not surgery, but serenity. Not the dramatic, but the dispassionate. Not experiment, but equipoise. Not submergence in internationality, but sustainment in triumphant nationality.
Now ignore his run-on sentence a minute. Ignore his alliteration. But he is saying, which he could condense, I'll agree with that. But he's saying we're gonna tweak things and get things back to normal. We're not gonna overthrow anything. We're not gonna do anything overly dramatic, because, as has been alluded to this afternoon, there is a great fear of socialism, of communism. The Russian Revolution has just taken place in 1917, so there are radical ideas in this country. He is reassuring people that's not the road we're going down. We're just going to do things in a common sense manner, and we're going to work day to day. So he's being calm about what he's saying, but he is saying something pretty powerful, that we are going to get our house in order here. He says, by normalcy, I don't mean the old order, but a regular, steady order of things. I mean normal procedure, the natural way without excess. So let me help him out here. In other words, normalcy meant the sluggish government had to shake off the cobwebs, industry needed to crank goods out again, and we all needed to start reassembling our day-to-day lives. Perhaps he should have called this the new normalcy, so he wouldn't be misunderstood 100 years later. We know what happened on Election Day. Harding won, and won big. More than 60% of the vote, 404 electoral votes. On March 4th, 1921, it was time to go to work and make normalcy something real. Throughout Harding's administration, his policies were called the policies of normalcy. And this is something you don't run into in most history textbooks or anything, that there was a cohesive program that he's putting into place. The administration called them that, the press called them that, and the subsequent Coolidge administration called the Harding policies the Normalcy program. So the words were more than a campaign slogan. They were actions. Harding's view of the presidency directly influenced how the normalcy policies were brought to life. So let's discuss this for a minute. I told you a little bit about Wilson's philosophy, and I did that because I want to contrast the way Harding looked at this, because this is going to absolutely impact how these normalcy policies are enacted. First, he believed deeply in the separation of the three branches of government, executive, legislative, and judicial. He also believed that the presidency was not superior to the other two branches. So this is, Wilson liked all the powers centered in the executive branch. Harding doesn't see things that way. He put together what he called a best minds cabinet, selecting people who were experts in certain fields who could work independently. Again, a direct contrast from how Wilson saw his cabinet. He didn't believe that any president was sufficiently intelligent to be a sole decision maker. He didn't believe that the president was the embodiment of the will of the people, nor a spokesman for any particular political interest. This was a marked difference in the way Wilson viewed the presidency, as we've discussed. Harding put together a good cabinet, even though let's get it right off the bat here. He had a weak link in Attorney General Harry Doherty. We all know that. Okay? Two other men highly regarded in the beginning, Charlie Forbes and Albert Fall, would destroy the administration's honor after Harding's death. But when it was formed, the national press and Congress hailed the cabinet as one of the best of all time. The architects of most of the normalcy policies were Harding, Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, the great organizer, and Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes. So they are going to form the nucleus of these normalcy policies. Almost immediately, though, the entire Harding cabinet swung into action. Postmaster General Will Hayes reorganized the post office. And I know that sounds like a little, what are we spending so much time on the post office? But as been said, the post office, we're still trying to get mail to everybody. It's a very important part of the social fabric of the country, the business fabric. So the post office is trying to get new customers to keep itself solvent. Wait a minute, that sounds familiar. Okay. John Weeks initiated reforms in the War Department. Albert Fall made administrative improvements in Interior. Doherty's going to put into action several overdue changes in the Attorney General's office. With Harding's help, Hughes is going to work to ease the battles between the White House and Capitol Hill that had been erupting since 1918. Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon immediately is going to work to reduce government expenditures as the first step in a return to prosperity. Hoover converts an inactive Commerce Department into pro-business activity, and Henry Wallace is going to work on establishing the rights of the farmers. So right off the bat, this administration is going to work. I'm not going to try to dissect the entire Harding administration. You would be asleep in your chairs, or put every policy in front of you. Instead, I'm trying to give you a snapshot of the return to normalcy, what it looked like. I'm choosing just a few of the threads from that cloth, and I'm going to give them to Harding to stitch together. It won't be perfect. There's going to be dangling strings that aren't going to get repaired well enough, but we're going to start to see how this ragged cloth becomes strong enough to carry forward from the confused jumble of post-war America. Let's go to April 12, 1921. Harding is going to address Congress for the first time, and he's going to lay out this normalcy program. He wants Congress to take up domestic issues first. So he first wants an emergency tariff to help the farmers, because we talked about they are in dire straits. They need to start getting back on their feet. He wants to lower taxes. They went up during wartime, and so he wants to get them back in balance. He wants to create more efficiency in government by eliminating job duplications and pushing for a law for a national budget system. He wants to create a strong merchant marine, so that's the ships that are going to carry cargo to help in a trade, as we're trading with Europe and other countries, and also a preparedness for war. He wants to reduce railway rates for freight, create new lasting farm credit legislation, tighten immigration controls, and later to come in this administration were Harding's plan to push land reclamation and irrigation to allow parts of the South and the Southwest to open to settlement. So think Arizona. And his support of an 8-hour workday in the steel industry. In foreign affairs, he wants to implement a vehicle for world disarmament. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. He's going to have a peace conference in simple terms. He wants to investigate an association of nations to prevent war, but not the League of Nations. And just in a nutshell, his problem with the League of Nations and most Republicans was a segment of it called Article 10, which could have been interpreted a number of different ways. It basically said if any member nation goes to war, you're going to support that nation. And Harding was among a group of senators that went to the White House to talk with Wilson and said, what do you mean by this? Is this a legal obligation to go to war or a moral obligation? And he said, well, you need to search your hearts. Well, that's okay, but they were so fearful of getting back into a situation where there were alliances. They knew by then World War I had been created by alliances, a domino effect, and the countries kept tumbling because they had all these alliances in Europe. The last thing we wanted was something that was going to entangle us in the same way. It's not the notion of the League of Nations that's the problem. And Harding wasn't against cooperating with other nations. It was that instrument. And so Wilson was asked to either clarify or amend Article 10, and he said, no, it's going to stand like it is. Okay, then you just lost the League of Nations. That was the problem. It wasn't that anybody was saying, no, we don't want to cooperate with other nations. That wasn't it. So Harding is saying, yes, we need to have an association, but we've got to put it in the right package. We were still legally at war when he comes into office. The armistice has been in place since 1918, but because the League of Nations, which is part of the Versailles Treaty, was not ratified by Congress, we're still legally at war with Germany, with Austro-Hungary, with the Ottoman Empire. So first matters of business is he has to solidify peace treaties. I always thought that'd make a great Jeopardy question, of which president officially ended World War I, because of course everybody would raise their hands and say, it was Woodrow Wilson. Then you could yell at the TV and say, no, it was Warren Harding. It wouldn't get you anything, but it might make you feel good, I don't know. So in a nutshell, this is what he's going to work on. Hopefully you can see that we're also dispelling another Harding myth. He was not an isolationist. And that's the first thing that you'll see in history textbooks, a lot of them, is that Harding in that whole era, they are isolationists. He's not. Look at his foreign affairs agenda here. He is not disengaging with the rest of the world. He doesn't want to. And he even realizes in the post-war world, the United States could not retreat into its shell even if it wanted to. This was becoming a global economy, even at this point in history. It could protect its interests, but that's a far cry from disengaging. World events had indeed created a new normalcy. Those who assume that we played our part in the World War and later took ourselves aloof and apart, unmindful of world obligations, give scant credit to the helpful part we assume in international relations, Harding told Congress that day. After listening to Harding's speech that April day, a Congress divided among special interests, that's new too, isn't it? Found something to love and to hate. In my old newspaper reporting days, that kind of a reaction to a controversial story meant you had hit the nail on the head. If you had people both hating what you said and loving what you said, that meant you did it right. Let's take a look at some of the social issues which were put on the table. We talked about the Klan a few minutes ago. And you'll see what a very, very complicated time in history that is. This is also part of his domestic agenda. And you'll see that Harding addressed all the major issues plaguing the country. He didn't have answers for all of them yet, but they had his attention. So he wants to create a federal highway system. And this is why. Look at this mud here. But a federal highway system which would connect the major roads in each state across state lines. It was not unusual for the highways that we praised here in Ohio, that we thought was the most important. Maybe Pennsylvania didn't think the same way, and it would turn to dirt at the border. So it's very hard to get from state to state. So he said, well, we need to figure out which highways we want to improve across state lines, and then matching funds. We do that all the time today between federal and state and local to improve these highways. He wanted to enact a maternity bill for women and children. Now, what they're concerned with here, it says maternity bill, but it's the mortality rate for infants. That's mostly what it was, to improve health and hygiene for mothers and their children so we can improve the mortality rate. And he wants to develop and regulate aviation and radio. Right now, in the post-war era, most of the pilots that were active during the war have found jobs delivering mail, airmail. And he is promoting aviation as a new commercial industry that we should develop. And radio, of course, it debuts actually on the night of his election. KDKA Radio out of Pittsburgh announces the election results to a very small audience. Most of us don't have radio sets yet, but this industry takes off like wildfire. Well, you've got all these new stations. You start out with a handful in the early 20s, and just in 2 years, you've got over 300 new stations. So the airwaves have to be regulated so everybody can broadcast. He is concerned about an anti-lynching bill. We talked about the Klan. Yes, the Klan is alive and well, particularly in the South. There are still a lot of lynchings taking place, and he wants an anti-lynching bill passed. I'm going to tell you right now, it's not going to pass. It never gets out of committee, and it's held up by the Southern Democrats. It is introduced throughout the decades, another 7 or 8 times. It never passes. We never pass this. But he's asking for it. He wants to consolidate a lot of social programs into a Department of Public Welfare. Right now, they're kind of scattered throughout the government, and he wants to consolidate that. He's not going to achieve it, but he wants to do that. And the Veterans Bureau. These soldiers who came home from Europe, amputees, some blinded by the mustard gas in the trenches of Europe. We needed to consolidate services so they could get medical attention they wanted. We needed to build veterans hospitals, and we needed to give them job retraining. So consolidate all those services into a newly formed Veterans Bureau. And these Native Americans are here because he wants to push their desire to become U.S. citizens. They are not. They have no rights in our country. He won't get that accomplished before he dies, but Coolidge will complete it for him. But look at all the major factions of our country that are touched with really serious problems that he's going to have to address, hopefully, during this administration. If Warren Harding had interpreted normalcy as going back to the old days, he wouldn't have accepted the vision that automobiles were going to be a huge part of our future, that aviation should evolve from just carrying the mail to a commercial industry, that the radio waves needed to be regulated. He didn't ignore the problems the nation had been wrestling with. If he had, he wouldn't have endorsed an anti-lynching bill or have addressed the race issue publicly in his first year as president in Birmingham, Alabama. This was a new world, a combination of old, nagging problems, lots of new ones, but wonderful opportunity as well. So now what? Harding was going to try something radical. He was going to try to work with Congress. He was the first sitting senator to be elected president. I'll let you figure out the other two. That's your Jeopardy question for later. So working those relationships was logical. Harding understood firsthand that he couldn't get anything achieved without consulting congressional leaders. And he ranked congressional input second only to the cabinet. So he issued Congress, all of Congress, both parties, a standing invitation to the White House, where Wilson had invited select members only on special occasions. Harding lunched with members of the Capitol on their turf, hoping for mutual understanding. In short, he tried to keep the lines of communication open. In the end, sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Oops. Now let's talk about the power brokers in the Congress he had to work with. It was a Republican Congress, but if you think it was smooth sailing, it definitely was not. I'm not sure it ever is for any president. Congress was divided, yes, along party lines, but there was a stronger division at work. Two powerful blocs were at each other's throats in Congress. The Farm Bloc, which included us in the Midwest, as well as the South and the Far West, actually cut across party lines. So you had Democrats and Republicans united in this special interest group. The other power bloc was the industrialists, and I really like the Monopoly guy that I found for him. That's mostly centered in the Northeast. There is a great animosity at this time between the East Coast and those of us in the heartland. The East Coast, that's of course where people perceive the big money was. They are the ones with running the big newspapers. They're making all the big decisions. And those of us in the Midwest, we're a little resentful of the whole thing. And we feel we're being looked down upon a little bit as well. You've heard, I know, like Mencken, who criticized the way Harding talked. He called it Gamaliese. And all the run-in on sentences and everything, that it was outdated. Part of that is the East Coast, turning up their noses at Midwest values, because the way he spoke was perfectly accepted by people he gave speeches to. But that's a really good example of this division and how the Farm Bloc always is saying, well, we're just as good as the East Coast, the Wall Street, and we need to be paid attention to. So they make things difficult for everybody a lot of times. The Farm Bloc wanted Congress to first take up tariffs for farmers before they would help with what the industrialists wanted, which was tax cuts. After a lot of bickering, both houses agreed to an emergency tariff to help the farmers. But by the end of the year, 5 more pieces of legislation for farmers were put in place. Now, a word about the tariffs for farmers. Tariffs are not the way we would probably go today. But in this time in history, using tariffs was accepted by both parties as being a very logical step. So with the help for the farmers, we've got our first repair for the torn cloth. Perhaps surprisingly to us, both parties were on the same page when it came to immigration. Quotas was the word of the day. The per centum law was passed by Congress actually at the end of the Wilson administration, but Wilson didn't like it and let it die. Congress brought it up again in April of 21, so Harding's been in office for a month. It passed the House in a few hours. Can you imagine an immigration law passing in a few hours? And it was sent to the Senate where it passed 78-1. Harding signed immediately. Now the Per Centum Act, or the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, was officially called Targeted Europe Immigration. It restricted immigration annually to 3% of a country's nationals residing in the U.S. in 1910. The law was designed to discriminate against immigrants from Southern and Southeast Europe, and it was designed to discriminate against immigrants from Southern and Southeast Europe, and North and Western Europe, Great Britain, France, Germany, Austria, they also will be limited to 3%, of course, and that was about 175,000 immigrants for 1922. But that was about the same as they had been sending over, so it didn't affect them. But South and Eastern Europe, Greece, Italy, parts of Russia, also were limited to about 175,000 a year. But they had each sent 685,000 immigrants the 2 previous years, so this really affects them. A footnote here, professionals for any nation were allowed in with very few restrictions. So this was a measure aimed at the poor and the unskilled. This passes the House easily, and the Senate just 1 dissenting vote. This absolutely reflected the thinking at the time. Bred by fears of anarchy, communism, we are afraid of the ideas that somebody's going to bring in. We don't want someone coming in who's going to be a financial drain on the country, and we want someone who easily can assimilate into the American way of life. This more restrictive immigration policy was pushed by such diverse groups as the American Legion, other patriotic organizations, as well as the Ku Klux Klan. Big business liked it because it gave them, they thought, protection against foreign ideologies. The Protestant clergy pushes it because they don't like Catholicism. The liberal media is behind it. And those preaching about the decay of American society due to a poor crime-ridden immigrant population, everybody's on board. So what a crazy bunch of people all mixed together supporting this. Although Harding believed in this restriction, he thought this way too, he also sometimes torpedoed his own policies. Steamship lines competed to get their cargoes of immigrants to New York Harbor first and unload before the monthly quotas were met. So the steamship lines are racing across the Atlantic, hoping they can stay first and dump their load and go back, because that's how they're going to make money. They are not going to make money if they're returning people to Europe. So yes, it's about the money. If a quota for Greece were reached, for example, the other ships carrying Greek immigrants would have to turn around and go back to Europe. Harding often ordered the rescue of immigrants stranded in New York Harbor so they wouldn't have to be returned to Europe. He realized there were problems with the policy, and he worked to the end of his life to correct them. One of those corrections was to send a representative to Europe to explore the immigration processing system. The result were tighter screenings at the foreign ports, thus counting back on immigrants being rejected on our end. This was the beginning of the screening process that we have today at airports and immigration centers in other countries. In 1921, this law was considered a success. So successful, in fact, that Calvin Coolidge limited incoming immigrants to just 2% of the 1910 census. So this is going to be the policy of the 1920s. This was hailed as a major step to normalcy. The passage of the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921 was achieved very quickly. This act required the President, with the aid of the Budget Bureau, to prepare an annual budget giving Congress a complete overview of revenues, expenditures, and a forecast of the administration's plans for the future. That's what the President does every year now, and it started with Harding. Warren selects Charles Dawes as the budget director, who said he would take the job on one condition: that the Bureau of the Budget be impersonal, impartial, and non-political. He told Harding, and he was pretty straight talker, "You must realize that you are the first president to tackle the job of a coordinated business control over the departments. I doubt if you recognize the strength of the 150 years of archaisms which you must fight. Delay, linger, and wait is the watchword of bureaucracy." He said the task would be like having a, quote, toothpick with which to tunnel Pikes Peak. Dawes was an excellent choice for the job, but said he would just stay a year because of all the bridges he knew he would burn. For the year ending June 30th, 1922, a nearly $1.4 billion reduction was realized. By a year later, the Harding administration's budget reductions represented nearly $2 billion as compared to the final Wilson year of 1921. In 1922, Dawes wrote several things in his journal. They're kind of surprising things, I think, to most of us. He says, "My mind keeps reverting to the present. In all my life, I've had no more satisfying an experience than I've had under President Harding. This work could not have been done under a weak, vacillating, or irresolute man." Speaking of fiscal matters, he said Harding's mind was quick as lightning. When have you ever read a textbook describing Harding's mind as quick as lightning? This is new. He says his ideas of business are exact. His knowledge of business principles and what must be done to establish them is as profound as that of any great businessman. Wow, does this go against the grain, doesn't it? This isn't what we've heard for decades and decades and decades. So the Budget Bureau is a major component of the Normalcy program. Focus now turned to tax cuts, a cumbersome, dare I say, boring, hard to understand subject for many people. Harding expressed his frustration with figuring out the right balance and the many layers of the matter to his speechwriter, Judson Welliver. "I can't make a damn thing out of this tax problem. I listen to one side and they seem right, and then, God, I talk to the other side and they seem just as right." That could be me talking. I can understand that. A major absence in the bill was tax relief for the low income, but tax experts largely applauded it for a step forward in industrial recovery. By the way, listen to this. Fewer than 28% of the nation's eligible voters and fewer than 18% of those gainfully employed had been required to file a tax return in 1920, and not all of these had paid a tax. Little different. So was this a feather in the administration's cap? Not quite. Farm bloc's back. The Senate farm bloc suddenly changes course and decides to put the cumbersome tax issue on hold, and they now want to discuss the soldiers' bonus bill, which was much easier to understand and extremely popular with the constituents back home. The bonus bill would pay combat veterans so much per day for their service and was meant as a way to thank the vets. While Harding liked the sentiment of the bonus bill, he was against its passage. It included no funding mechanism, and the president said we just couldn't afford it. He personally asked old Senate friends to back off the bonus bill, but that didn't work. So he changed his tactics, and he does it in a very dramatic fashion. On July 12, 1921, he appears before the Senate in person. That is a shocking breach of precedent. And he talks to the Senate in a 20-minute speech. He scolds it for putting the tax revision on the back burner, because that is a major component of getting the economy back together. And he doesn't want them picking up the unfunded bonus bill. He demands a new tax law at once. So this is what he says. "I'm fully persuaded that three things are essential to the very beginning of the restored order of things. These are the revision, including reduction, of our internal taxation, the refunding of our war debt, and the adjustment of our foreign loans. It's vitally necessary to settle these problems before adding to our treasury any such burden as is contemplated in the pending bill," so the bonus bill. Well, the Senate's irate. And some say, not so quietly, that Harding's behaving like Wilson. That's always the thing they dangle. They say, well, yeah, you're sounding like Wilson now. You're sounding high-handed. But they couldn't fight his public popularity. So many Americans liked the fact that he had stared down the Senate. And the New York Times said, the people are with him. There's nothing for the Senate to do but recommit the bonus bill. So discuss it some other time. So the Senate does postpone the bonus bill, and they grudgingly go back to the tax bill, but they're not happy at all about it. They have huge debates, and the farm bloc really start to thump on Mellon. So This is not going like any honeymoon should, I'll tell you. The Revenue Act of 1921 ended up being a very equitable tax. It contained some relief for everyone, rich and poor alike, and represented this is Murray saying, a typical product of compromise politics. Harding realized this. He happily signs the measure on the same day it was passed, November 23rd. He said it fulfilled his campaign promise of lower taxes, and in the first year, savings amounted to over $800 million. Now we'll give him his feather in his cap for that. When Harding began his administration, he concentrated more on domestic issues, as we've said. His thinking was the United States needed to clean up its problems and lead the world by example, and that had to happen from the inside out. He really wasn't comfortable with the notion of installing mini Americas all over the world. Hopefully, he thought, other nations would see how we did things and would naturally want to duplicate our system. But he wasn't into nation building, which had previously been our foreign policy mantra in decades past. He ended up making quite a significant impact on world affairs. Take a look at this photo. He's signing the Knox-Porter Resolution, more casually known as the Treaty of Berlin. This officially ended war, as we talked about, between the United States and Germany, and then other treaties followed. So this is the beginning of putting things in order, putting the war behind us when he's officially going to put it to bed. In late fall 21, he convened the Washington Disarmament Conference, which was the world's first peace conference.
Gentlemen of the conference, the United States welcomes you with unselfish hands. We harbor no fears. We have no sordid ends to serve. We suspect no enemy. We contemplate or apprehend no conflict. Content with what we have, we seek nothing which is another. We only wish to do with you that finer, nobler thing which no nation can do alone. We wish to sit with you at the table of international understanding and goodwill. In good conscience, we are eager to meet you frankly and invite and offer cooperation. The world demands the sober contemplation of the existing order and the realization that there can be no cure without sacrifice, not by one of us, but by all of us.
4 months of work follow that day when he convenes the conference. He's going to step out. He is not going to be in the day-to-day. He's going to turn that over to his Secretary of State, Charles Evans Hughes. He's doing that for political reasons. He doesn't want the work of the conference being sidetracked with politics. And he knows, being president, that's what it would happen. He wants them to get something done. So he's going to step aside, and Hughes is just going to report to him each day about what's going on. Florence Harding actually is going to sit in the gallery on most of those days, so she'll also report to her husband. She's very interested in this work of this conference. So they worked for 4 months, and these are the world's great naval powers at the table. A battleship was your weapon of mass destruction back then. So that's what they're concerned about. They come up with the 4-power treaty and the 5-power naval treaty. And without getting into the nitty-gritty of the treaties, suffice it to say the success of the conference boosted the confidence of the world in realizing that America was not backing out of international affairs. So they can point to and say, well, they're bringing everybody to the table, so they're not going to become an isolationist nation. Now, by World War II, the significance of the treaties were downgraded. The problem by then was that bad faith on behalf of several of the attending nations superseded what Charles Evans Hughes called the will to peace. In other words, if a nation intended to circumvent a treaty, it undoubtedly was going to find a way. At the time, though, it restored a balance among nations in the post-war world. So we're going to give Harding credit for 2 fixes, formally ending the Great War and trying to find an avenue for lasting peace. And yes, we're going back to the Veterans Bonus Bill because it's going to raise its head again in March of 22. And again, it's proposed with no funding provisions. Congress wanted passage because the midterm elections were coming up and this was going to play well at home. Against Harding's wishes, the Senate called for a debate in August. Funding is going to cost $4 billion from some unknown pot of money. The bonus bill passes Congress anyway. The bill is going to give each honorably discharged vet a service certificate with a value of $1 per day for home service and $1.25 per day for overseas service, which if held for 20 years would increase in value about 3 times through compound interest. The largest paid-up amount in 1942 would be about $1,800, about $28,000 in today's money. Well, Warren vetoes it, says, yep, I sympathize with it, but we don't have the money. It's going to increase the public debt by 1/6. The House overrides him, and now it's up to the Senate to see if they can override his veto. They come up 4 votes short. So that's a close call. There were 7 Democrats among those who held up Harding, interestingly enough. Harding knew the more popular thing would be to sign the bill, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. He told Charles Dawes, I'm very sure to be much complained against for many months to come. However, I can stand that without annoyance in view of the fact that I have the satisfaction of knowing I did the wise and best thing. His veto received mixed reviews. The American Legion condemned him. The business and finance community applauded him. There also was an unforeseen gain. His firmness had surprised Congress, proving naysayers who had predicted he would merely be a puppet of congressional Republicans. He emerged from this battle with renewed confidence. Harding's pet project was building a strong merchant marine to haul cargo. And he wanted Congress to approve this, that we could allot some money to this to rebuild an aging merchant marine. He saw it as worn out by war and necessary for peace. He saw this program as no different than helping the farmers. So he goes to Congress, and it's a kind of a complicated program with ship subsidies. He wants private shippers to purchase some of the government ships, and then they can replenish things. And this fails. Congress could care less. They're not interested in it, and so Harding has to postpone the whole thing. Now, this looks really complicated, but it's not. But I wanted to sum things up with where we were. By spring of 1923, that's just 27 months into Harding's presidency, most of the goals he outlined in the Normalcy program have been fulfilled. And so we've got a lot of, this is kind of what our state of the, just basically, no transition plan. This is what we started with. No transition plan from wartime to peacetime. Prohibition, I haven't talked about too much, but it's horrible to try to enforce. Nothing's going to work, and it's going to be a pain throughout its existence. Dealing with all those veterans issues, employment plus the medical side of things, the high unemployment, the war liquidation, the farmers, that anarchists who were very real in the United States. They had planted bombs in a lot of mailboxes of judges across the country. They were a really real thing. And of course, the United States still being at war. So here's our cloth that we're trying to mend. So he does cut the taxes. He puts in place a budget system, which operates on a business model. Farm legislation we get accomplished. The Veterans Bureau is working. That immigration, no matter what you think of it, it's in place. The peace conference, attempt to stabilize the world. World War I is officially ended, and the war debts are being addressed. It's a mixed bag, what is accomplished here in his term here. He pushes for a world court, which was really unpopular. That doesn't go anywhere. So he fails with that. He fails with the anti-lynching bill. He doesn't get them to come up with any new ideas for the Association of Nations. He doesn't get the Public Welfare Department and his beloved merchant marine that he wants so badly he gets nowhere with. He does accomplish the federal highway system, that maternity bill, radio, aviation enforcements here. Prohibition, it's still hanging out there. Racial tensions, still hanging out there. They're going to for a long time to come. But it is an attempt to move us forward. The economy gained momentum in the spring of 1923, and business growth was occurring. Normalcy program did gain in public understanding and favor, and things were looking good for Harding to be reelected in 1924. Now, Harding took his Normalcy program with him on his trip to the western states and Alaska in June of 23. The purpose of the trip was to take a first-hand look at the territory and its potential for growth, and to check in with the American people. His fundamental question for the people was, are the Normalcy programs working? During what he called the Voyage of Understanding, he gave 14 major addresses and dozens of whistle stops en route to Tacoma, Washington. He talked about what was on his mind clearly and confidently, regardless of which of his ideas were politically unpopular. So he did push very strongly on that trip for that World Court membership. He talked about continued help for the farmer, a lot of these things that still had not been accomplished, but he still thought were very, very important. The speeches reflected optimism and were very forward-thinking. Although in the White House for just 29 months, President Warren Harding successfully stitched together the fabric of the nation using his return to normalcy policies. Every problem wasn't solved, they never are, but he successfully mapped a route for the new United States, rising from the aftermath of the world's first global war. The very real return to normalcy and Harding's humane, hands-on relationship with the American people put us back on track, reinstilling our personal and national confidence. Warren Harding was the right man in the White House at the right time, and he was the person who brought back normalcy to the United States. Thank you. Any questions for me? Or are you ready for dinner?
Can I make a correction? On your photograph of the cabinet,
Yes.
you know, you have Henry Wallace, but you say it's Forbes. And Forbes is not on
No, I didn't say it was Forbes.
Yeah.
Forbes was in there.
Well, it says Forbes.
Yeah, Forbes is in there.
Yeah, but he's not in that picture.
Yes, he is.
Well, you show me it was Wallace.
Okay, we'll talk about that afterwards. I'll show you the picture. Anything else? Yes?
Was Harding, did he take a lead in the immigration restriction law, the Quota Law 21, or was this sort of something, as you said, Congress voted for overwhelmingly, and was sort of going along with Congress?
He's going along with the thinking. He doesn't have any problem with it, and nobody did really. They knew, they believed, they didn't know, they believed that stemming the tide of immigration was going to naturally prevent these outside ideas for coming in, would help people get jobs here, because of course you had folks that thought that the immigrants were taking their jobs and everything. So it was accepted by him without question, as it was by most folks. Any other questions for me? Okay, then I'm done. Thank you.